I'd like to read a few passages from the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. And we'll just commence at verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now, I'm sure you know this story fairly well. You remember that Naomi then suggests to her 2 daughter-in-laws that they stay in their country while she returns. And then you'll remember what Ruth says in verse 16. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said, "No more." So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. The woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Just 1 or 2 verses in chapter 2. Verse 1, now Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." Now come over to chapter 4. In verse 1, now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now come down, verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon, also Ruth the Moabite, The widow of Mahlon I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers. And from the gate of his native place you are witnesses this day. I'll just come down, maybe just to verse 18. These are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. We trust that the Lord will bless the reading of his word to us. I suppose often at this time of the year, the little town of Bethlehem is strangely in everybody's minds. Strangely for the reason that it was of no significance pretty much through most of Israel's history. In fact, Micah says, doesn't he, in his prophecy, that from Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Israel, yet out of thee shall he come forth. It was maybe just a population of a few hundred, even in the time of the Lord, maybe not much more than that. It would hardly have made any headlines in the census of Herod. It was just a little town. The book of Ruth is a book that perhaps I had misunderstood more than most. Perhaps by the time I finish speaking, you'll say I still don't understand it. But nevertheless, I had misunderstood it perhaps just as a love story. Just a love story between Ruth and Boaz. And yet its importance in the scriptures is far, far greater than that. You might notice just where the book ended. It ended with a genealogy. And it ended with somebody's name. And that person's name was David. The significance of this book historically is perhaps far greater than we realize. Because in between the book of Judges and then when we come into Samuel and then into David eventually coming to the throne and the reign of David, there's an obvious question. Where did David come from? How did he come into this royal lineage? Was he a usurper? And that was a common accusation against David, wasn't it? Even in his own life. There was the tribe of Benjamin that felt when Saul and his family and his sons had been removed from the throne, and now David was made king. There was this sense in their hearts that David had done some kind of underhanded deal to get to the throne. That was an incredibly important thing for God to establish David's right to be king. Not just, of course, for David's sake, but for David's greatest son's sake. For when you come to Matthew's gospel, you'll know the way it begins. He's Jesus Christ. He's the son of David. So it was incredibly important from a historical fact for God to establish David's right to be king, and that God was behind it, and God had ultimately brought him to the throne. It's also an incredible thing just historically for a moment to think about the timing of this book. If this book ends with David's genealogy, you'll notice the setting of it. It begins in the days when the judges ruled. There was a famine in the land. And you remember that in the time of the judges, the book of Judges ends that there was no king. And every man did that which was right in his own eyes. There was no king on the throne, and yet you're not going to be very long until you get historically into the next book, 1 Samuel, before Israel is crying out for a king like all the nations around them. But while they're looking for a king, and they have their own idea of who their king is going to be, it's amazing in this little story of Ruth, in this little town of Bethlehem, God has already got his strategy for bringing a king to the throne through the story of Ruth and Boaz. So while Israel's thinking that they're going to need their own strategy, their own plans about how they can get a king, God already behind the scenes, is preparing ultimately for the arrival of David. Well, whose story is the book of Ruth? In one sense, you might even argue that it's Bethlehem's story, because it does take it from obscurity. The first reference is in Genesis with regards to the burial of Rachel. That's where she was buried, just outside Bethlehem or Ephrata. So you have it, but associated with death. But here now in the book of Ruth, more than anywhere else, I suppose, in the Old Testament, Bethlehem is brought to the forefront of people's minds. It's going to be in this little town where this great story of redemption is played out. Bethlehem's story. You'll notice how many references, even just that we read as we were going through it, the references to Bethlehem. They left Bethlehem. They went back to Bethlehem. The people of Bethlehem went out. And at the end, if you listen to what the elders say, when Boaz agrees to marry Ruth, he says, they say, "May you act worthily in Ephrata and be renowned in Bethlehem." It is quite remarkable, isn't it, that here this little story, even in Israel's history, that they perhaps didn't even see the significance, that yet 3,000 years later, we're still talking about this little town in Israel, in Judah, called Bethlehem. Of course, it's far more than just a story about a place. You might say it's obvious whose story it is. It's named after Ruth. And in one sense, it is about Ruth. An incredible story about a woman that God raises up and uses, a Gentile woman from Moab. It is remarkable as well, not only just from her perspective, but from the perspective of the circumstances in which this story is set. As I said, it begins by saying, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. If we were just to stop and in our minds imagine what that was meant to mean to the reader, if they went back and they looked at the book of Judges, they would find some awful things. Right in chapter 2 at the very beginning, it begins by saying that the people that rose up, the generation that rose up after Joshua's generation, they didn't know the Lord. But not only that, but they had forgot what God had done. What had God done that they had forgotten? They forgot that he redeemed them out of Israel. The very thing that the people had forgotten would be the thing that would be emphasized in this story, in this little story of 3 or 4 people, that they needed a redeemer. So in the background of the time of the judges, when people had forgotten all that God had done, he's going to remind them in this little story of their need, ultimately, for a redeemer. But not only that, but if you were to read through, and particularly as you come through the end of the book of the Judges, one of the things that becomes evident is what happens when people do what is right in their own eyes. And just the sense of lawlessness and callousness, and in particular, what's striking is this, the way that women are treated. At the end of the book of Judges, by the men that usurp beyond what God ever intended for a man to do and act callously towards women. And in the background of a nation who had now maltreated women, there's going to be a story about a man who's going to treat a Gentile woman with the greatest degree of honor and respect. Not only that, but you see that there was a famine in the land, and as you probably know, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. So in the very place where there was meant to be food, there's a famine. And that would have triggered in their mind, no doubt, a recollection of the law and of what happened if they would break the law. One of those curses that came would be that there would be famine in the land. Now, sometimes perhaps people see all very negative connotation on Elimelech and his sons for leaving Bethlehem. I maybe just wouldn't be so quick to be hard on him. If anything, really, the place where the blame is laid is on the land. It's on the people in general. There was a famine in the whole land. This wasn't just Elimelech's fault. This wasn't just a story about his departure. This was a problem that had now gone through the people, and there was a famine in the land. But he says, in that land there was a man of Bethlehem in Judah, and he went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And you'll know that in the story of Ruth, they go down to Moab. And again, I wouldn't be just so quick to be come down hard on Elimelech. Not sure what you and I would do in a time of famine. There were times when Abraham and he went down to Egypt. We know there were people, of course, who remained in Bethlehem, like Boaz. But in any case, he goes down and tragedy strikes the family. Elimelech dies. Then they're there 10 years. His 2 sons die. And now they're left, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. Ruth's story is remarkable, isn't it? Again, it's almost deliberately set against the apostasy and idolatry of the nation of Israel during the time of the judges, that in that time when they had forsaken God and turned their back on God and been disloyal to God and trusted other gods, here's a woman who's in a difficult circumstance. She's had no children, and she's lost her husband, who claimed to know the only true God. I don't know if that had been you, but if that had been me, I think I might have said, there can be no truth to this story. Why would, if this God of Israel really is the true God, how could he possibly leave us in this state? There must be no truth to the story. Not only that, but to be honest, she has a mother-in-law now who isn't just the greatest advocate for the God of Israel either. Because you remember that she says to the people as she returns, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. Call me bitterness. For the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. And in spite of that, this woman, Ruth, says, I will go with you. I will lodge with you. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. Incredible act of faith, wasn't it? In spite of all of the circumstances, in spite of all that she was possibly going to leave behind, she makes this courageous step to leave it all behind because she wants Naomi's God, who Naomi herself had almost lost hope in. She wants her God to be Ruth's God. Well, as you know, then she arrives and she goes, and much of this story in some respects is, you'd almost say, by chance. Doesn't seem like God is behind the scenes. It just seems like things are just happening like everyday circumstances. Here's a woman then, and she decides that she'll go out and go and join the reapers to try to get some food for her and Naomi. And as you know, it says that it almost as though she happened upon the field of Boaz, just by chance. The one field she comes to happens to be the field of Boaz. And then you'll know eventually that story about how she comes in contact with Boaz. And she, in a sense, makes a proposition to Boaz that if he was to redeem all that belonged to Naomi, she would be prepared to be his wife. He recognizes her loyalty. He recognizes her faith. He recognizes the reputation that she has, even now amongst the people of Bethlehem. She had acted honorably towards Naomi. She'd acted honorably towards her late husband and her father-in-law's name. You see, she could have gone and stayed in Moab. And in fact, even when she got to Bethlehem, she could have married somebody else. But she remains loyal to Naomi and all her family. Boaz, of course, agrees with the idea. And now you might say, well, maybe the story is about Boaz. And to a degree, it is, of course, the story of the Redeemer. Without him, there is no story. Naomi and Ruth were almost at the point of running out of money. I suppose that's why all they had left was this field that had belonged to Elimelech. But without anybody to work the field, without anybody to make money from it, they would be destitute. And so it was almost a crisis point. Of course, to lose the land was almost the final death knell to Naomi, because there was a sense of honor. That was an inheritance. That had something been passed down by God ultimately, down through the generations and down to her and her husband. And now her husband had gone, her sons had gone. And now all that was left was this plot of land. And now it was almost gone as well. They needed a redeemer. The story here, as you know, has two redeemers in it. That is, that they needed somebody who, from their family, would be prepared to buy the land from Naomi, if you like, but then give it back to Naomi and to give her the money for it. So you see how that would work financially. This was a pretty good business deal. Basically, the proposition was this. Look, if you buy the field off me, this is what the kinsman redeemer had to do. You buy it off me, and you give the money to me for it, and then it becomes back to me again. Now, I think you have to be a persuasive saleswoman to get that past most people, but this was the deal. Of course, the first man that's approached, who's the nearer kinsman, he was further in line, closer in line than Boaz was. He initially thinks he'll do it until something is brought into the deal. You notice the way it's put here. He says, Boaz says, will you redeem it? Will you buy the land? But he says, okay, I'll do that. But then when he finds out Ruth is included as part of the package, he says, I'm sorry, he gets cold feet. He says, I'm not prepared to mar my inheritance. Why was he concerned about marring his inheritance? Well, I suggest perhaps what might have happened, or at least in his mind, was this. Now, it's not even clear whether he had any sons to take on all that he owned. But there was perhaps in his mind this concern that if he married Ruth and had a son, then all, not only of what Naomi had, would go to that boy, but perhaps a lot of what he had would go to the boy. So he's thinking he's going to get really shortchanged by this. Not only does he have to buy the field and give Naomi the money for it, and if he takes Ruth and he has a son, he might not only lose what he paid for the field for Naomi, but he might lose a lot of what he already had. And he steps back from the proposition. But this man Boaz, he says, no, I'll marry Ruth. And I'll really put what I have on the line. He's prepared now, what we might say, to mar his inheritance. He's prepared to lose something in order that Naomi gets this field, and it remains in the family. And he pays what is required. But then I think maybe Professor Gooding, it would be strange if I didn't at least make one reference to Professor Gooding. I'm not even sure you're allowed to speak at Apsley without making at least one reference. He notes here that really perhaps the story is about Naomi. Not even so much Ruth and Boaz. Ruth and Boaz are just the vehicles through which this woman Naomi is blessed. It begins with all her loss and all that she loses through the death of her husband and her 2 sons, and she's left with nothing. And that sense of where is God in just the general run of life. She's almost at the point of losing hope in God himself. But you'll notice when you get to the end of the book and the son is born, you'll notice in whose lap they put this son, Obed. They don't put him in Ruth's lap. She was the mother. They put him in Naomi's lap. And the women say to Naomi and to those around, a son has been born to Naomi. She says, and they say, bless the Lord because he has not left you this day without a redeemer. They're not actually thinking about Boaz here. They're thinking about this boy that's been born. He will ultimately be Naomi's redeemer. Why? Well, because when that boy grows up, he'll guarantee, safeguard Naomi's future. It'll be him that'll work the land. It'll be his land now. And the name of Naomi won't be lost, and she won't be put into slavery. All her hopes now are in this boy that's been put on Naomi's lap. Ruth and Boaz are almost gone from the story. The attention now is on Naomi. And the woman who felt that almost everything had been lost now has a lap full of the hope and blessings of God. Her whole future now secure in this child that's been placed on her lap. But I'm going to suggest to you that someone else's story is even more important in this. And that's God's story. It's not obvious, is it, when you read through the book, just exactly what God is doing. But it is quite clear that God is at work. One of the great things about this little book is this, that it takes ordinary people's lives and their little insignificant stories and weaves it into God's far greater story. I don't know if you find that encouraging. But here was Ruth in Moab. She was a nobody. She was a stranger brought into Israel. She just trusted in the God of Israel. Under his wings, she'd come to trust. She was a no one. She was an outsider. She was a foreigner. Maybe you identify with that this morning. I don't know. I don't think there'd be too many churches in Belfast today that would have as many foreigners and strangers as Apsley. I think we might nearly be in the majority. I see Gavin's got his hand up. That's not that easy, is it, being a foreigner in a strange land? You feel on the outside of the story. You're just a periphery. People ask you, as soon as you open your mouth, where do you come from? You're not from here. How do you know that? You have that sense of being on the outside. You might feel like that in a different kind of way, that you're from the outside. You're a stranger. But into God's great story is woven a woman who felt a stranger. There was also a woman who felt like God had dealt hard with her through the circumstances of life. Naomi. She'd been faithful. She'd gone out to Moab. She had lost everything. God had brought her back empty. That can be an experience of many people. They're not foreigners, but they feel like God has dealt bitterly with them. And perhaps in people's little stories of life like that, it's easy to wonder what God is doing. Has God any part at all for my little story in his great story? But that's true of Naomi. And she finds herself in God's great story. Then you have a man, Boaz, and he's the kind of man that just does everything right every day. Gets up in the morning, he brushes his teeth, he goes to work, he just does the right thing. In a world around him that was doing everything that was right in their own eyes, he was a man who maybe just went to work every day and wondered whether his life would mean anything. He just did the right thing. He was an honorable man. He was a large-hearted man. He was a gracious man. He was prepared to pay something from his own expense out of kindness to Naomi and to Ruth. And he might have wondered at a time, would anything come of his little story? Just a man that did the right thing every day that he lived. And yet his little story gets woven into this greater story. Whose story is it? I'd almost begin to think it was Elimelech's story, you know. There's a possibility to think that way because it begins with Elimelech. And actually, there's a lot of references to Elimelech all the way through this story. Why does Boaz do what he did? Why was he willing to pay the cost for the field and to take Ruth? You say he loved Ruth. I'm certain he probably did, but that's not why the Bible says he did what he did. Well, you say he had pity for Naomi and her plight. He did. But that's not the reason that the Bible gives as to why he did what he did. Well, you say he had a duty as a kinsman redeemer. Well, he did, but not legally. Because under the law, only if you were a brother did you have a legal obligation to redeem what the field or the family of your brother who had died. Boaz was under no legal obligation to do what he did. Why did he do it? 2 or 3 times in chapter 4, what we read was he said this. He said, I'm doing it for somebody else's name. I'm doing it for Elimelech's name. That Elimelech's name might not be lost from the gates of the city of Bethlehem. What did he mean by that? Well, you see, the problem was if a man had no sons, then his name would be lost, would never get carried on. Now, to you and I, in the day in which we live, that doesn't seem like a big thing, and not a big loss. Now, what does it matter if my name's, well, I've got Tim, but whether you think that's a great thing or not, I don't know. But it doesn't really matter in our culture if our name doesn't continue. But it meant everything to these people if a family's name was lost. You see, their inheritance had been given to the family. Even go back to the tribes of Judah. It mattered, didn't it, about what tribe, what name did you belong to? And the danger here was Elimelech's name would be lost. And there's a man prepared to do something in order that the honor and reputation of another man's name would be upheld. You know what his name means? Well, actually, we pronounce it probably in a way that muddies the waters. We'd be better off pronouncing it like we do Elijah. Or I think in Northern Ireland, unlike the Scottish, you say Elisha as well. Certainly in Australia, where we all pronounce things correctly, that's the way we say it. But that helps us because we break a name into 2 parts. But when we say Elimelech, we lose actually this a little bit. Because really it's Eli as the first part, Melech the second. Eli, God, my God. Melech, somebody else had a name. Actually, his name began with that part, almost the same root. His name was called Melchizedek, king. My God is king. So here's a man, Boaz, and is willing to put his own inheritance at risk to uphold the honor of a man whose name was, "My God is King." You know, the gospel is a strange story, isn't it? Why did Jesus Christ do what he did? You say he did it because he loved us. Surely he did. But that's not perhaps the big reason, is it? He did it because he had pity upon us. He did it for that reason. He certainly didn't have any legal obligation to do it. He didn't do it for that reason either. Why did he do it? Well, in John's gospel, I think above all, we're finding this, that he did it to honor someone else's name. Someone else's name that there was a great potential would be lost. And he did it out of honor for another's name. That's why he came. That's why he gave up all that he had. That's why he risked marring in his inheritance. It's a great risk of bringing you and I in to share it, isn't it, that we'd mar it? But that was no risk that he wasn't willing to take. But ultimately, behind it all, there was someone else's story at stake. There was the God who was King. May the Lord bless his word to us.